Good afternoon. Today is September 3rd, and this is episode 3 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. Today, we're going to stick to our extreme weather topics, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about hurricanes. The last episode, we talked about the Fujiwhara Effect and how hurricanes can interact with each other, but you might have been asking yourself, what is a hurricane? You've seen them on TV, you hear the meteorologists talk about them, but how much do you actually know about these summer storms? Well, a hurricane is an organized storm system that is different from your typical storm system in so much as it is organized in a spherical or a circular shape. Now, if you can, picture in your mind's eye a meteorological map that you might see on the evening news. You see a storm front moving from west to east across the United States, and you'll see usually a straight line of thunderstorms moving through an area. That is a typical low pressure system. It's got low pressure on one side and high pressure on the other, and that moves it either north or south, but generally the winds will keep it moving west to east. Well, a hurricane is similar in that it's a low-pressure system. Thunderstorms require a low-pressure system in order to operate. But when that low-pressure system forms in the tropics, rather than over the North Pacific or even over the continental United States, as can be common around the Rocky Mountains, something different can happen as that system moves from east to west along the tropics. Now, I don't want to get into the trade winds. It's an entirely huge discussion that we could have at a different time, but you can think of the Earth as a large convection oven. And by convection oven, I mean that there are winds moving in both west to east and east to west directions. That's both in the north and southern hemispheres, basically creating a big circle around the top and bottom of the Earth, divided, of course, by the equator. And within a few degrees of the equator, 5 or so, you don't find a lot of really east to west, west to east moving winds. It's relatively calm. If you do find any, they will generally be going with the rotation of the Earth and not impacted at all by this convection cycle. As air moves from the poles to the tropics, essentially you can think of it as cold air being towards the top of the Earth and warm air being down by the equator. As we get warm air, it starts to move further north, and as you get cold air, it moves down towards the equator. Imagine during this time, the Earth is also spinning, so of course, this creates a circuit over each of the bodies of water in the world. For us here in the United States, and specifically if you're on the eastern seaboard where hurricanes impact more often, this convection cycle takes storms out over the northern Atlantic. They may impact Europe and around those areas, and then the trade winds take it back south. The moisture will move out over the Mediterranean and then down into the South Atlantic, where it will gather storm surge again and get some strength, and then move back towards the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard. Well, if there is a disturbance in these winds, a low pressure system can develop. And at the beginning, they'll look just like any low pressure system you've seen on any meteorological chart, and that is a straight line of storms. But as the warm water from the tropics starts to feed a convection cycle of these thunderstorms, it can actually start an independent rotation. These storms will start moving counterclockwise on their own, separate from a line of storms. That line, if you can imagine, will start to curve, and it'll form essentially a spiral arm with a small center, and that's it. As this cycle of warm water being brought up into the clouds and then condensing into raindrops, forming clouds and falling back down, as that occurs, it leaves excess heat up in the storm, which gives the storm strength. And as the storm grows stronger, the clouds get bigger. This powers the convection cycle more. And if the conditions are just right, if the ocean temperature is warm, if there's no wind shear that's going to defeat the formation of the storm, this cyclonic force starts to spin and it gains strength, and that one curved arm of thunderstorms will actually start to form multiple arms of thunderstorms around a central point of low pressure. Now, once this system starts to organize in a circular pattern, now we're going to start calling it a tropical cyclone. That is a general term. We have different names for it in different parts of the world. In the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, and the Northeast Pacific, we use the term hurricane, or the scale that leads to hurricane. This is a tropical depression that leads to a tropical storm, and then a hurricane that has multiple categories depending on strength. In the Western Pacific and in the Southern Indian Ocean, they use the term typhoon to describe this, and in the Northern Indian Ocean, they use the term severe tropical cyclone. Now, you'll note I haven't named all of the oceans or all areas of the ocean, and that's because these storms don't form in all areas of the ocean. The most prolific formation zone is in the center of the Pacific that impacts the Asian coast where Japan, China, and Korea are. The second most is the West African zone, which feeds storms into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the United States. There's another zone that sends storms towards Australia, and yet another one that sends them into the Indian Ocean, and that can send them to Africa or up to the Indian subcontinent or even to Southeast Asia. But otherwise, there's not enough heat in the water and not enough convection for these storms to form, at least at this point in history. Now, as you know, the surface of Earth is made up of tectonic plates, and the crust is moving constantly. So in a few million years, this may absolutely change. In fact, we are looking at the formation of a new continent right now. But that is a topic for another day. For now, let's stick to hurricanes. So we have a tropical cyclone that has sustained winds above 34 miles per hour. It's a low pressure system, which means at the center, the atmospheric pressure is starting to fall. And there is a direct correlation between the falling atmospheric pressure and the wind speed. The lower that pressure gets at the center of the storm, the higher the wind speed. One of the lowest recorded central atmospheric temperatures was near 900 millibars, which sounds like a lot, but it's not. And that led to wind shears of 190 miles an hour. But we're jumping the gun just a little bit. So we start out with a tropical depression. This is an organized storm system. It's generally moving in a counterclockwise manner, and it sustained winds around 39 miles an hour. Once those winds exceed 39 miles an hour and up to about 74 miles an hour, now it's a tropical storm. Once they exceed 74 miles an hour, we are now in hurricane territory, and the categories go up from there. A Category 1 hurricane has sustained winds at 74 miles an hour. A Category 2 will have something upwards from there. And then Category 3, 4, and 5, where 5 is the worst. Now, you've seen a picture or a video of a hurricane, but what is it exactly? Well, a hurricane is lines of thunderstorms. I described them at the beginning there. Now, just imagine that they replicate. There are multiple bands of thunderstorms circulating around a central low pressure point. Well, once this convection oven of a storm kind of starts, then a few other things happen. The air that's being drawn up from the ocean is going to create a cirrus cloud cover over the top of this storm. It still allows us to see the bands, but it creates a general circular pattern. As the pressure drops and the wind speeds increase, that creates a different kind of convection pattern where winds will come down through the center of the storm and move outward underneath. This is what creates the high wind speed of the storm as it comes ashore, but more importantly, it clears out that center portion of the storm and creates the eye of a hurricane. Now, at the eye wall, you will have some of the most intense winds and some of the most intense rain. In fact, a hurricane can drop up to 3.4 trillion gallons of water a day. But once you pass into the eye wall, things are relatively calm. There are low winds, there is a clear sky. In fact, if you were in a hurricane, you might actually see the sun out. It would seem like a pleasant day. But as soon as that second opposite eye wall passes over, you are right back in the heart of a hurricane. The rains are most intense in the center, and it gets less and less as you get to the edges. A really organized storm will have a very clear eye wall, visible from space in most cases. It will have a very low pressure in the center. It'll have very clear bands of thunderstorms wrapped around it with a thin cirrus cloud layer over top. You'll see a great big circular storm with arms that are clearly defined and a very clearly defined eye wall. Now, going back to the beginning, these hiccups in the air system that may lead to a formation of a storm, that can happen relatively often. But a lot of factors, again, like the ocean temperature, the wind speeds, the wind direction, can cause the system to lose strength. And actually, during a hurricane season, which of course in the North Atlantic runs from June 1st to November 30th, and in the North Pacific runs from May 15th to November 30th. During that period, a lot of storms will start to organize. We'll get some tropical depressions. You'll get a lot of those. Then you'll get some tropical storms. And a lot of those will stay relatively unorganized, just enough to become tropical storms, but not enough to worry anyone about. When they get a little more strength and a little more organized, then we give them a name. And there are 11 meteorological centers all around the world that can give a storm a name. In the North Atlantic, typically NOAA in the United States plays a role in giving a storm a name. And if the storm gets strong enough and impacts lives enough, that name will actually be retired. Most recently, storms Katrina, Rita, and Sandy, as well as Hurricane Andrew from the 1990s, were all retired, so there will never be another one of those storms. Now, you might ask yourself, why do they even name storms? Well, that was actually started way back in 1877. One of the first meteorological predictors, a guy down in Australia, actually started naming storms because when they would come frequently, he wanted people to know this is a different one than what we talked about before. So if I talk about Andrew, and then I talk about Bert, and I talk about Kathy, these are all different storms. But you'll notice that I there did exactly what we do every year. Each storm of the season will start with the next letter of the alphabet. Now, after he retired, it actually fell into disfavor for a while. After World War II, they brought that back. And since 1977, it's been standard for storms to have names. And between the 50s and the 70s, it was already pretty standard, but they only used female names to name storms, which is why some of the biggest storms from the mid-century, you know as the female names that they were given. But after 1977, we started naming them both male and female names. Those names are shared and agreed upon by the meteorological agencies and all of the newscasters. And again, they'll be retired if the storm has a great impact on life and property. But if we ever got down to Hurricane Zeta in a year, that would be a really bad hurricane season. If we're nearing November 30th and Hurricane David, or Tropical Depression David, is making its way toward the United States, that's a very light hurricane season. Generally, named storms will have between 11 and 20 per year, and generally only 1 or 2 will actually impact the United States, although that is getting higher and higher each year. It also seems as though we're being impacted by more storms and more intense storms, and this is caused by the ocean water rising in temperature as the rest of the Earth rises in temperature as well. You know, I could talk way more about hurricanes. There's so many interesting facts, but I think that's going to be enough for today. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Make sure you follow us on all social media at Rob Explains. Have a subject? Did I get something wrong? You want to correct me? rob@robexplains.com, or you can just leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to get to those right after the show goes live. Thanks for joining me once again and look forward to tomorrow's episode. But until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.